Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and Happy New Year. Welcome back to the Sydney Saxophone Network Q&A sessions. And I hope you all had an enjoyable break. Very exciting. As you can see, we have some new premises here at Sydney Saxophone Network Q&A headquarters. There's a few little bits and pieces still need fixing, but overall it's mostly complete and almost looks fairly identical to what I had before. Anyway, enough ranting. To kick off this year, we're going to be changing the format a little bit, so we're just going to be scaling back in terms of the amount of these that we do, since things are starting to ramp up here. But rest assured, we will be continuing on. And to start off 2021, I'm absolutely delighted and excited to be talking to the one and only Richard Percival. Now, for those who aren't aware of Richard or may not know the extent of the work he's done, he's been around here, there, and everywhere over the last 30 years or so, and he has done some amazing work. You might have heard him, and you may not even know it, at a lot of professional shows around town, including Cats, Nine, Chess, West Side Story, Chicago, Ain't Misbehaving, Anything Goes, Guys and Dolls, 42nd Street, Boy from Oz, Threepenny Opera, and so much more. He's just an amazing multi-woodwind extraordinaire. Not only that, but he's a fantastic composer and arranger, and of course an educator. But with that, we'll get into a bit more of this during the Q&A. But without further ado, I'd like to extend a big welcome to Richard. Thank you, Richard, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure.
Oh, no, very excited. So we'll hit the ground running with an easy question. So obviously you're a multi-instrumentalist, but and you started off as a clarinetist. What was the thing that got you onto the saxophone? Was it a natural progression from clarinet, or was there something else that sort of sparked that interest?
Well, actually, the first instrument was a recorder.
Oh, wow.
I found an old abandoned doll mesh plastic and a sort of primitive version of the Tune a Day at the school that my parents used to clean, and I used to clean with them. So I took it home to my little shed, and because I've always listened to music, and that's something we'll come back to later, I think that's a big sort of thing of mine, learning the thing seemed sort of easy. You had the little diagrams and you had 4 beats and you could divide them by 2 or 3. I mean, it all seemed blindingly easy to me. So by the time I got to what was called intermediate school in New Zealand, I was, reasonably adept at the recorder, and was probably the best recorder player in the place, which wasn't difficult, seeing most of them were sort of working out which end to blow in. I was very lucky there. A guy called Bruce Aitchison started a recorder orchestra, and I got to play lead in that. And because I'd done that, I was offered a chance to go to clarinet or double bass. And as we didn't have a car, I opted for the clarinet. And there are days that I regret that decision, especially looking for the one good reed in the box,
Yeah.
But I went to clarinet, and I took to that as well, and enjoyed it. And around the age of 13, I think I decided that I was going to be an orchestral clarinet player. That was the dream.
Mm-hmm.
So I headed off to university. And while I was there, I wandered into the disc library, as it was in those days, the vinyl library, and found myself in the jazz section, which was like half a dozen dusty albums right at the back. And I found 2 albums. I found Kind of Blue, Miles Davis, and The Best of John Coltrane. So I relieved the music department of the duty of having to keep those, and I took them home, and it was like a light going on. I played those albums until literally there were no grooves left. I just played and played and played. And I realized that I couldn't go through the rest of my life without knowing about that music. And my partner, who I met shortly after that, had a big jazz collection. So that started me listening that way, into listening to the saxophone. And I really thought, I've got to play this thing. So I wandered around. I was in Christchurch at the time, and I found in a junk shop for about $200 a Selmer Mark 6 tenor.
No
I
way.
had no idea that it was a great instrument or anything. but it had a burglass and mouthpiece on it, metal, that somebody had worked on on a grindstone. You know, you could actually see the marks on it.
Ooh.
So when I tried to play it, all it did was squeak. And I thought, wow, either the tenor's a really difficult instrument to play or this is a bad tenor. So I swapped it for a Yamaha student model alto that went down to about bottom D before the combined leaks, you know, made it unplayable. And that was the instrument that I sort of battled with for about a year before coming to Australia. And what brought me over was the jazz course with Don Burrows. Right. So I knew nothing about jazz. You know, I hardly knew a thing about it at all other than what I'd listened to. So I ripped off a Charlie Parker solo, I think it was Au Prévave, and I ripped off a Paul Desmond solo. I think it was Theme from Black Orpheus. Should have been in G minor, but because my cassette player was running slow, it was an F sharp minor, which was quite a challenge for the people who accompanied me for the recorded audition. And I sent that in, and I was accepted and came across and worked with Don Burrows at the Con, and that was an incredibly steep learning curve. You know, I really just had to try and get to grips with an instrument which I really knew nothing about. You know, I was entirely self-taught. So that's what led me here. Unfortunately, I had Cole Lockton as a teacher, and that's what opened up the rest of my, you know, learning history. But that's how it came about.
Yeah, right. Okay. This is a fascinating story. Now, I should have mentioned this earlier, sorry, but as you said before, you're originally from New Zealand, and you had trained initially as a classical clarinetist, and, you know, as you said, you were the main goal initially was to, you know, get a job in an orchestra, and of course, as you were just talking about, you know, you took a bit of a detour and went the other way and came to Sydney and studied, you know, with Cole and Don Burrows, and went through that course and everything like that. But you also studied with a bunch of other fantastic teachers overseas as well. Maybe you could talk about maybe just backstepping a little bit in terms of maybe initially talking about your sort of key teachers on the clarinet, and then maybe going into your saxophone teachers. I know you touched on them a little bit, but maybe talk about what sort of things you studied and what sort of things they showed you, particularly on those instruments.
Yeah. Well, my first teacher in my little hometown was an amateur flute player who worked in a bank, and he did the best he could for me, and I will always be grateful for that. But I was largely self-taught, and but because I'd always listened to music, I think I had a concept, always got a fairly good sound. So I ended up in the local orchestra, and two very wonderful people, Frank Oxley and Heaton Drake, arranged for me to get a scholarship that flew me across the Cook Strait to study with Frank Gurd, who was the principal of the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra at the time. And he was one of the greatest influences on my life, not only as a musician, but as a human being. He was just the most warm, wonderful, generous human being. And I've always tried to sort of emulate him as a teacher. He used to come down in his Mini, pick me up from the airport, drive me up to his home. We'd have about a 3-hour lesson, during which he'd smoke a packet of cigarettes. And his wife would feed me, drive me back to the airport. All of this for $20, you know. Wow. So, I mean, as a role model, as a human being, you know, not just as a musician, he was fantastic. And I really only went to him to study the Mozart Concerto because I was playing that with my hometown orchestra. So that's all we got to cover in that time we were there. But he was a huge, huge influence to me. Then I went down to uni. I didn't really have a great teacher at uni. Didn't suit me. I know it was someone that Mark Walton liked, but it didn't work for me. I needed the ground up feeling. So I think the next significant teacher would have been Cole Lockton, I think, who was the first one who sort of opened the door to the saxophone for me. And we really started to talk about how the thing worked. Don Burrows was great too. He was lovely, and he was really, you know, very patient and wonderful man. He was really wonderful. And it was through Cole that I went to study with Victor Morosco. And for me, I think, even though I don't agree with everything that Vic taught me, you know, it was a light going on. We went back and we rebuilt my playing right from the bottom up. So I spent 6 months in a wardrobe in Los Angeles, 3 or 4 hours a day, you know, playing the first 4 bars of the Bach Ario. So, you know,
Wow.
it was quite a painful experience. But it was the first time I really had that. He had studied with French clarinet teachers particularly, so he had that really scientific approach. I could say to him, I can't drop a sixth clean, you know. He'd say, well, it's because of this, do these exercises and you'll resolve it, you know. It was the first time I was able to get that really clean analytical approach to learning. So I used to record the lessons, take them home and transcribe everything from the lessons. That later became what became the workshop manuals for the Teacher on Tap series. So I kept all that information, you know. And I think for me that, you know, that for the next 10 years, I worked on trying to absorb that information. And while I was in Los Angeles, I also studied with a wonderful man called Abbe Fraser, who was about New York Jewish guy in his 70s at the time. Mm-hmm. And he used to teach Mike Post and a lot of the film writers. And I went to him and studied counterpoint with him. And we used to make me do it in soprano, alto, tenor, and baritone clefs. And we have cantus firmuses in breves. We could use semi-breves, minims, and crotchets, and all of those strict rules of 16th century counterpoint, which once again was really a painful experience. But once again, it got me in touch with the foundations of music and how it works, you know. So I think those are the teachers that were the most significant in my life. You know, they were the ones who really made the big changes, and I'm eternally grateful for them. And I hope in some ways that I'm able to pass on that legacy to some of my students.
No, it's fascinating. And we will be talking a little bit later about your teaching philosophy and approaches. But just sort of to finish up this component, the teachers you study with, all fascinating, and, you know, each, you know, giving you know, different elements, and, you know, putting together how you play today, and, you know, all the things that you've learned. What were how do I put this? Sorry, it's a bit rusty. It's been the holidays, so I'm a bit rusty at the old thing. What was probably a couple of the most valuable lessons that you took away from some of these people? Was there anything that sort of maybe you said you had a few light bulb moments with some of these teachers, but was any sort of thing, anything particular that sort of really absolutely stood out in terms of like a definite kind of lesson or an approach or something that kind of really stuck with you?
Yeah, I think, I mean, which each person had something to offer, but with Morosco, I think, you know, one of the things was significant for me, and I try and help was learning how to practice. You know, I'd been a self-taught musician. I always practiced for long hours, but I always practiced very inefficiently. So one of the major things I think I got from it was how to structure practice, how not to waste time. And if you're a doubler, you know, that becomes a very important part of your life. I think from Morosco, I went through the basics, went through breathing, hand position, the basics of articulation. You know, those things were really significant for me. And I mean, even things like just posture, you know, there's something I really push with a student now, you know, is just how you sit and hold the instrument, how much that affects it, you know, the whole mechanics of how the thing works, which up to that point, I had not really considered, you know, I just try to get a noise out of the thing. So I think he was significant in that. He was really significant. And when I came to the con and you started the jazz course, I mean, I was way out of my depth. I learned more in the first 6 months than I learned 4 years of university, you know, because you were applying harmony. You know, it's the same harmony as Bach would have used, you know, in the partitas and all this, but because you were applying it, it was another light bulb moment, you know, where the conventions of Western harmony really clicked into place with me. So that, you know, those were some of the really big light bulb moments that sort of accelerated me forward a little bit.
Okay. Now, obviously, having such a broad musical palette in terms of music that you've performed and studied and whatnot, you would surely have quite a diverse range of musical influences. What are some of your musical influences, or key musical influences, I should say, because being musicians, it's always an ever-evolving thing. And what about those, or what about them, sorry, appeals to you?
Well, yeah, I mean, over the range of instruments, there's a lot of people. We stick around the saxophone specifically.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the people who really appealed to me, I always loved Eugene Rousseau's playing. So I'd always loved the sound he got and always loved his approach. Um,
Nice. Richard, really sorry to say it, but your broad width actually went down when you were answering that question. So we only got bits and pieces. Would you mind terribly repeating that again? And I'll do a bit of editing magic to fix that up.
All right, okay. So we'll go back right to the beginning of that. And I said, that
Yep.
we'll restrict it to the saxophone because otherwise we'll be here all night. In terms of the classical saxophone, the people that I sort of loved and tried to model myself on was Eugene Rousseau. I loved his playing. Steve Giordano had studied with him, so he put a lot of that music my way. Otis Murphy is someone that I listened to a lot just for the sheer mastery of the instrument. Those are the kind of influences, but there are a lot of people, a lot of people that I listen to and take something from. On the jazz contemporary side, Phil Woods was my first hero, and he was the first person I sort of aimed to sound like. I liked Parker and I liked Cannonball, and there was a wealth of people there. And I like Maceo, and I like Gerald Albright. These people for me. Trying to think who else. There's so many, but I think the person who stands out as, for me, the epitome is Michael Brecker. I think he is the master of the instrument, the master of the music, and will always be my hero on the saxophone.
You can't argue with that. He's an absolute master, as you say, and it's what can you say? Really, it's just he was all over it. Now, going back to sort of your transition from being a classical musician to a jazz musician, I'm hesitant to say that because, I mean, there's always a part of you that, you always comes back to that and you're always continually playing that and switching between styles. But initially, when you first switched from predominantly being a classical musician and then going into jazz, how did you find the initial stylistic change in terms of your approach? Did you find it an easy transition, or was it a bit difficult at first?
It was horrendously difficult. I was way out of my depth. I got into the audition because it was a recorded audition, but I really knew nothing about the music at all. And I've had a series of these in my lives. I went from my hometown, where I was, a reasonably big fish in a very small pond, down to Christchurch, where I ran into people like Mark Walton, Debbie Ross, and Keith Sprague, people who could, who were masters of the instrument already as young people. So that was an incredibly steep learning curve to just try and stay in the game there. And then when I came to the con, it was an even more steep, I remember the first thing, I always got a good sound on the instrument for some reason. So I got to play lead alto in the band, and the first chart we did was in a mellow tone. And I'd never really read jazz phrasing, I had a phrase, ba, ba, doo, da, da, ended on a quaver, So I was, struggling right from the word go. Everything about it was tough. But I learned a lot about jazz in a very short time. One of the most valuable things I think I learned was that I wasn't a jazz musician, but I did learn a lot about the music, and it's still, that and classical music are the two significant parts of my life. I've sort of had a series of infatuations with classical music, then an infatuation with jazz, an infatuation with Cuban music, an infatuation with Brazilian music, infatuations with funk music and R&B music. I've sort of lurched from one thing to another, which is dangerous, because you end up being the master of none of them. But as a teacher and as a writer in the field that I'm in, it's been an advantage because I do have an insight into the music. I've tried to play it. I think I write well for jazz musicians, because I've played enough of it to be inside the style. And I've certainly got to know a lot about music. There's a difference, though, between knowing about it and playing it. You know, there's a big essential difference there. So yeah, it was a very steep learning curve, and the doubling that came later. You know, I had to make a living to pay for the reeds, so I ended up working in the clubs, and I had to double in the club. So that was another steep learning curve. You know. In a very short time to learn these things. So yeah, it wasn't easy, but it was exciting, and I certainly learned a lot in a short time, you know, and had some help from some great people, and was around great musicians. I think that's one of the great things of places like the Con, is to be in the presence of like-minded people who are excited about the same things that you are. So you learn a tremendous amount just from having conversations with people. You know, that's the wonderful thing. I think you could, with what's on YouTube today, you could almost teach yourself in isolation, you know, because there is so much material available. But the one thing you can't have is that interaction with like-minded people. And that's the wonderful thing I got from the place, you know, and it will always stay with me.
Yeah. Well, you kind of sort of answered this, or touched on it a little bit anyway, but what advice would you give to younger players who might be looking to either switch from classical to jazz or vice versa, or alternatively, players wanting to become more versatile and develop musical plurality?
Oh, that's a good one. Plurality, I like that.
Sorry, that's all that PhD
I would say,
jargon.
The one thing I would say, just one word, I say this to everything is, I say listen. You know, just listen to the music. That's your first step. You know, just listen to it and absolutely just drown yourself in the music. You know, listen to it. If you want to go from classical to jazz, then transcribe. You know, just transcribe. Don't buy transcriptions, or if you do, just use them for reference. But actually sit down and transcribe and develop that ear to finger response. You know, and pick up all the points of style, all the little, you know, the inexplicable things that you can only learn by copying. What else would I say? I think make sure that you've got the right equipment for the style. You know, you're not going to really have to go out and play rock and roll on yourself with C star, you know, so find out what's, you know, appropriate to the style, and get yourself some equipment that'll get you closer to what you're hearing. Use YouTube. I think, you know, that's such a useful tool now. You know, there's all the lessons by Leibowitz Brown, you know, those things he's putting up, those jazz videos, they're fantastically detailed. You know, you could get all kinds of practice routines that'll really take you into it. Don't be afraid to copy. Don't be afraid of learning patterns. You know, you run into purists who say if you learn patterns, you know, you're not being original, these kind of things. But I think you really do. Find a model that you love, find a player you want to be, and try and get close to that place you can. I would say that's good. Find yourself a good teacher or mentor to save you time, you know, and then if possible, just do it. Get yourself into a situation that's nowhere near as easy now as it used to be. You know, there used to be days when you could go out and you could go to jam sessions at night, or you could get gigs and you could play 4 hours of standards. Those situations really don't exist anymore. So you have to try and find ways that you can create those opportunities for yourself, you know, outside of a working environment. But I think listening is the one that people tend to miss, you know, as that's really the crux to everything. And this is my personal little thing. We'll come back to it later. But listen and copy and transcribe. Those are the things I'd say if you want to make that transition, you know.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a common sentiment shared by some other people who've had on here where we talked about this sort of thing, and that musical conception, I guess, that you would get through listening is super important to kind of contextualize what it is you're actually playing.
I think it is. Yeah, I think that's...
Yep. Now let's talk about your doubling. As I said before, you're a phenomenal doubler. I've had the good fortune to actually sit next to you in a pit, once, and I was literally being young and naive. I was very blown away by your skills and multitasking with everything, and I just was like, wow, that's so cool. I want to be like him in terms of the doubling thing, and it was great. But how do you maintain such a high level of proficiency across so many different doubles? Now you're not just your stock standard, your flutes and your clarinet and your saxes, but you also have other ones as well, I believe. That sort of quite a vast array of instruments.
Yeah, I suppose it comes out to 9 or 10 instruments, that you would use on a regular basis, and then there's a few odd ones, E-flat clarinets, contrabass clarinets, and things like that, alto flutes. But I wasn't at an equal standard on all instruments. I came to the flutes late, and they were the instruments that I was the least comfortable on. And of course, because they were my weakest double, am I still there? That's internet unstable again. Those were the ones I put the most time into, and that can be a frustrating thing. You watch your principal instruments atrophying a bit while you put all this time into an instrument that you're not necessarily that keen on. So yeah, I think the secrets to it, I think, is just practice and learning to practice efficiently. There's no way around it. You just have to practice it. And I think becoming, once again, infatuated with one instrument at a time. For a while, just being a clarinet player. Eddie Daniels talked about this too. He had the same thing. He was not only a wonderful, saxophone and clarinet player, but he was principal flute on lots of recording calls. That Paul Simon album, Still Crazy, he does the big flute solo on that beautiful song. So his thing was, he just immersed himself on one instrument at a time, and I more or less did that too. It's tricky, and it can be frustrating, because you're not giving all the instruments equal time. I think having a good teacher, seek out good teachers, that can save you an awful lot of time, and do as much playing as you can. Play as much as you can on the instruments in any kind of situations to find out, where the bugs are going to come in. Because, doubling sort of, you never quite know what's going to be written. It may not be particularly difficult for the instrument, but it might be quite difficult to go from, say, 2.5 pages of high clarinet to doing a whisper quiet entry on the top E on the flute, So you've got to practice strategies, of recovery, ways of being able to deal with these things. And you get better at it the more you do it, I think. It's pretty much the core of it. A lot of practice is basically what it comes down to.
Right. So the old saying, practice makes perfect, is certainly true in this case.
You're back. I lost you for a second.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say the saying that practice makes perfect is quite apt for this particular scenario, I guess.
Yeah, I don't think there's any way around it. One instrument is enough for a lifetime. 3 or 4 instruments is more than enough for a lifetime. And the risk you run is ending up being mediocre at all of them.
Yes.
So there's no choice.
Yeah. Now you've already answered this in terms of my next question, where I was going to ask you maybe some advice or some pearls of wisdom you could suggest for players who are wanting to develop their skills or either maintain their doubling skills. And you talked about this, consulting teachers and playing and working out strategies. But is there anything else maybe you'd like to add in terms of what you could suggest for people to develop these skills a little bit more?
Yeah, I think one thing is, however you do it, knock off a wealthy relative or sell drugs or sell your sisters into white slavery or something, but get the money to buy yourself good instruments. It's difficult enough to double, but if you're doing it on a Selma Bundy or something like that, you're making it impossible. And it's a lot of money. A good flute could cost you 20 grand. Baritone could cost you in excess of 10 grand. A bass clarinet, it's going to be a big capital investment if you do decide to be a doubler. But and same with mouthpieces and equipment. But I would say, there are some wonderful. I know that Jock, Andrew Robinson. For years he played a student model Yamaha tenor. And he sounded better on that than just about anyone I've ever heard. So there are exceptions to this rule, but I think generally, you know, if you are going to go into the competitive world of drumming, you really do need instruments that work for you. So that's one thing. Second thing I'd say is you need to learn to practice super efficiently. So you need to be able to get the disciplines of practicing no more than 5 minutes on any one thing, breaking it up, keeping yourself mentally active. All of those little things we use to make every second of practice time count, because you know you're going to be spreading it pretty thinly over those instruments. What else would I say? I would say learn a wide range of styles. If you're going to go into doubling, chances are you're going to cross a lot of genres of music. So you want to get into understanding at least the fundamentals of how jazz improvisation works. You want to know how the clave works in Cuban music. You want to know the basic styles in Brazilian music. You want to be able to produce a sound at least that's good if you're going to play something in a funk or rock and roll situation. So, you know, I think if you want to go into doubling, you've got to open up your options in terms of the styles that you play. And I would say am I back again? Yeah, we have.
Oh yeah. Sorry, we got to, and you would say, sorry.
All right. So yeah, is to learn the classical repertoire of the instrument, at least to an extent. You know, Branford Marsalis is really big on this with his students, and he insists that they learn the classical repertoire if they come to study jazz with him. And I think it makes demands of you on the instrument that you know you need to face and you need to deal with. So yeah, those would be my general thrust of things if you wanted to go into doubling. Yeah.
Cool. Now,
don't do it. You don't really want to is the other thing, you know. Don't do it casually. If you're going to do it, it's going to take up a huge chunk of your life. So, you know, if you have to ask, should I go doubling, then don't do it, you know.
Yeah, so either all in or all out pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Now, Richard, I'd like to talk about your playing career because, as I said at the start, you've played with some absolutely monster musicians, and I was just like, when I saw your bio center, I was just like, wow, I didn't even realize you played with all these people. Like your the list of players is like, you know, it's a rap sheet. Like the Daley Wilson Big Band, more recently Sydney Jazz Orchestra, the likes of Natalie Cole, Olivia Newton-John, Michael Crawford, Grace Knight, Cher, Hugh Jackman, the Channel 9 Band, just to name like a small handful. Just want to sort of talk about maybe your early sort of career, particularly in Sydney, once you graduated, and what sort of opportunities and things did you, or sort of gigs that you ended up picking up just at the start of your playing career as a saxophonist anyway?
Yeah, one of the things that was very useful to young musicians in those days, and it doesn't exist so much now, was the clubs, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously not, sometimes not a particularly high standard, but you could get into a reasonably good band. The great thing was in terms of sight reading, you would go in and there would be a wad of music on your music stand and you would just sight read for 2.5 hours or 3 hours, you know, and you would do that 3 or 4 times a week. So your sight reading improved, you know, there was no way it couldn't. And I also used to write and arrange for those bands, so that developed that side. I toured with some terrible rock and roll bands, which made for amusing anecdotes, but nothing particularly good musically. So I think the club's big learning for me, and in those days there was a lot of work around backing up artists. So I toured with Howard Keel and Nelson, people on little tours around regional New South Wales, you know, and that sort of set me up for what would come later, which would be, you know, the really exciting and, you know, really, what am I trying to think? Just the really.
Okay, sorry about that. Welcome back. would you mind terribly maybe?
Where did we get?
Ah, geez. So you're talking about the clubs, and then you're talking about you're touring with some scrupulous characters in rock bands, and then you were saying you learn a lot in the rock in the club bands, essentially.
I learned a lot in the club bands. I learned to
Mm.
sight read, and I learned to arrange at a certain level for those things. And I got to tour with, some quite well-known names. So I got to learn, how to work in those situations, and I enjoyed the touring. So it sort of set me up for the latter part of my career when I got to work with some, really exciting big name people, which was, a thrill. Yeah.
Yep, no, that's cool. Now, as I said, I sort of highlighted a few ensembles and musicians you've worked with, and I mean, I'm sure I've missed at least 50 of them. But do you have a particular concert highlight? And if so, why is it so memorable for you?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of things, and they crossed different styles. I think one of the really big ones was working with Marie Schneider when she came out, and to play that music of hers and to play in the band with Australia's best musicians. It was just a really, really exciting, terrifying but exciting thing to do. That was really good. And same with Bob Florence.
Yep.
That was another sort of legend that you'd listen to all your life. You get to play with. They were really exciting things. I loved touring with Natalie Cole. The rhythm section was basically Frank Sinatra's rhythm section, and
wow,
it was a huge orchestra, 35 strings and full big band, and we would play the rehearsed part of the show in the first part of the evening, and then the second half of the show was just sight reading. But the rhythm section was so good, and the charts were all by the great names. So Nelson Riddle, they were all, the famous right at the time. So they were really quite easy to play because everything made sense. But that was an inspiring gig to have. I think, and one of the most enjoyable times of my life, strange enough, was with a band called Doug Smith and the Crisps, and I was working with a great singer and some wonderful musicians, and we used to work the midnight till 4 a.m. shift at King's Cross.
Oh wow!
In the days when it was still wild and exciting place. We used to be downstairs in the Persian room, and Dale Barlow was upstairs in the Paradise room.
Wow!
It was exciting. It was an exciting time to be around. The band had to survive, and we were playing music I liked. We were playing sort of sophisticated R&B. We were playing, music that I really enjoyed, and we had a good following, and we were popular, and it was an exciting environment. And really, I've got a lot of fond memories of that. I toured Japan with Sarah Brightman, and I loved that, not so much for the music, but for the people. That was a really lovely tour with wonderful band. I think 3 marriages came out of it. It was half an American and half Australian band.
Right.
We looked after very, very well, and it was good. It was great. You felt appreciated as a musician, and it was great to be in that place and see that part of the world I'd never seen before. So I have fond memories of that. And I suppose when I was at uni, I was sort of assistant principal clarinet in the Christchurch Symphony Orchestra, and I remember that was terrifying. Vancho Chavdaska was the conductor, and he was terrifying. But just to sit in there and play Beethoven symphonies and Bartok and things like this, and sit in the orchestra and be part of that sound, while it was terrifying, it was also, that's a wonderful, memorable experience as well. So yeah, I've got a bunch of them, and those are some of the highlights, some of the things that I will never forget.
Nice. Wow. Fantastic. Now, an interesting question, because as you say, the music scene is not what it was, particularly when you were starting out and at the beginning of your playing career. But in terms of younger musicians today, what sort of things could you maybe suggest or recommend they check out to help them break it or make it into the professional circuit? Is it networking, or is it certain things musicians, we talked about, you know, doubling and, you know, going all in and all out and all that sort of thing, particularly if you want to go into that particular scene. But just as a general thing for musicians, from your experiences, what sort of advice could you give to a modern younger player?
Yeah, it is definitely much harder now than it was. Much harder. I mean, there's just not as much live music, you know, and there's less opportunity. It is tough. I still think it comes down, you must master your instruments if you're going to go in, you know, so you have to practice and you have to really master the instruments. I think networking is important. So mixing with like-minded people, you know, and making contact with people who are in the industry is valuable. I think there's some very simple things, you know, be reliable, be punctual, don't be obnoxious, be open-minded. You know, simple little things like that can help you, you know, to really move forward in the business. A young student of mine called Abbe McCunn is now moving into the doubling area in the theatres and things, you know, and she has the perfect approach. I mean, she works really hard on the instruments, but she's got a great personality. She's willing to learn from anyone, you know. She's cooperative, she's punctual, she's good at everything she does. So that's sort of the perfect approach to getting there, you know, and I still think those things are important if you want to find a way into the industry, you know.
For sure. Now, I just want to sort of touch base again about your orchestral playing, because as you said, you know, you played like a lot of different works and worked with a lot of scary and not so scary conductors. But do you have a particular orchestral highlight? It could be, you know, clarinet or saxophone, if you have one. And in terms of like a favorite piece that you worked on, and yeah, what about that piece or concert resonates with you?
I still think, you know, in terms of a larger orchestra, the best memory will always be working with the Natalie Cole Orchestra. I mean, it was just those wonderful, wonderful arrangements, all those kind of things. When I was 17, I did the Mozart Concerto. I mean, I'll always remember that. I remember having my knees locked back in position so they didn't knock, you know. But
oh, wow.
It was wonderful. So go from one end of that concerto to the other and make it to the end. You know, those are some things. But a lot of the ones that we mentioned previously would, you know, be highlights of things that I've done with wonderful musicians, you know, around me. That's the great thing, to be surrounded by those people, you know, who you admire so much.
Now, your work in musical theatre. Now we talked about, you know, you're a fantastic doubler, as you said, but and you know, you've worked with a lot of great shows all over the place, and you know, for years and years, playing like pretty much almost every single book out there. But how did you actually get into the musical theatre scene?
That was another thing. It was easier in my day than it would be now. In those days, it was a great deal of work. There was a lot of work in the clubs. There was work in recording studios. There was work in television bands. So there weren't, you know, people didn't particularly want to work in the theatre. You know, it meant being tied down to 8 shows a week. I don't think the money was as good. So a friend of mine was working a show called Saxophone. It was then Her Majesty's Theatre, which no longer exists. And he needed a sub, so I went in and subbed for him. And must have done all right, because I got called back. And then I went to America and studied. When I came back, I needed money desperately, and the chance to play Cats came up. And so I just grabbed it. And then from that point onwards, I think it was 2 years of Cats.
Wow. Oh, I think we lost
into the theatre scene, and it.
Oh, I think we lost you there, Richard. Sorry.
Where do we get to?
You were talking about 2 years of Cats, and then it clapped out.
Oh, right. Yeah. Don't you love Zoom?
Oh, yes, yes.
Are we back? We got a connection now?
We are back. The NBN is an amazing thing.
Yeah, so Cats. It is. Yeah, Cats was the first, really long run. It was 2 years at Cats. I didn't stay for the whole 2 years. I left and came back. But that sort of made the connections into the theatre world. And from that point on, the theatre became a substantial, core of my income. And, it was what I was suited to. So it served me very well for 40 years or so. It's great.
What are some of your favourite books that you've played? Oh, he's logged off, and I'm sure he will come back very shortly. Whilst we just have a brief intermission, again, we're talking to Richard Percival this evening, and we're currently discussing his introduction to musical theatre and some of the experiences he's had, in particular looking at a few of the currently we're talking about some of his favorite books that he's played or worked on. So Richard, thank you for joining us back again.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a bit of a dodgy connection here tonight. As I was saying to you, I think probably the greatest musical ever written has got to be West Side Story. So to play that is always, a thrill, despite the fact it was 7 doubles or something like that. It wasn't comfortable, but it was great to be part of. Boy Morris was a great show to play because it was so fresh and new, and they were still writing it when we were rehearsing it. There were so many. I mean, there have been so many, and a lot of them are good. 42nd Street was good because it was so well written for the instruments. So it was a real joy to play. And it was written by a musician who understood the instruments. So, those are 3 that really stick out of the ones that I enjoy playing the most.
Okay. Now, just to finish up this component, you've sort of talked about a bit of this already in terms of things that younger players should be looking at if they want to get into a music scene in general, but also musical theatre. Is there anything else that you could potentially add to that, or you'd like to add to that, or is it just keep to the same things as you were discussing before? Be personable, be punctual, dedicate yourself to your instrument, make sure you're not half baked on your doubles, and was there anything else?
What else should I say? It's going to be very difficult to get in now. I mean, there's certainly more players than there are jobs in the theatre. So, be patient. I think one of the approaches to you is to play as many amateur musicals as you can. The money's not great, but, it'll get you into, how it feels to play in a musical. It'll get you that practical experience, and I think that's great. One tactic may be to go for the less common doubles. If you double on oboe or a bassoon, you're going to put yourself into a category where there's going to be less competition. So, that's one strategy to getting yourself in. Other than that, what we said before is, study your instrument intensely, cross a large number of styles and get inside those, and all the basic things of, just being punctual, being reliable, being easy to deal with.
All right, so I'd like to talk now. Hopefully, it's all fingers crossed. It's all holding in together, the connection. But your work as a composer and arranger. Now, you are a very accomplished composer and arranger, of course. In terms of your compositional output, you've written such an array, an array of musical ensembles, and such as big bands, woodwind ensembles, solo pieces, chamber music. And you've also recently received awards for your compositions, in particular, the Maurice Ravel Composition Competition. And of course, your arranging work is equally impressive. Playing some of your, personally having played some of your arrangements, it's always a great fun, and they're very well written, and I have a great blast playing with them, and also using as teaching resources as well. But I'd like to talk about how you actually got into composing and arranging. Was it something that sort of naturally, like a progression that sort of naturally happened from being a performer, or was there something that sort of kick-started your interest in this area?
Well, I suppose I always wanted, at uni I tried writing a few string quartets and things like that, half-hearted sort of attempts. But but it was the strange things that got me into it. I think one of the first things was I went to teach at a college, and I had to teach group lessons of saxophones, and the kids had this sort of rather turgid stuff they had to learn. So I set about and arranged some sort of the popular standards for saxophone quintets, and it did the trick. You know, it turned them from being sort of bitter and twisted into really quite enjoying it. So that started me thinking, you know, I can do this. And then I started writing duets for students around particular technical problems so that it became more enjoyable and less of a chore. And that started me thinking, I think I can do this. When I was at the con, I wrote for the big band, wrote appallingly for rhythm section, but that's something I've got better. And I always wrote okay for horns, but you know, it's been a long upward haul learning to write reasonably well for the rhythm section. I mean, that's another thing as a horn player. If you come to it, you've got to sit with the musicians and talk to them. You've got to write things that don't work and be told why they don't work and so forth, you know. But I learned a lot from there. I had to be an arranger when I worked in the clubs. Tony Hobbs and I had to turn out 2 or 3 arrangements of whatever we're going to do in the club each week. So that forced my hand in terms of learning to transcribe quickly and, you know, and getting the art going a little bit. What else? I wrote for Latin bands. I wrote and arranged and transcribed for Latin bands, and that is great for your, you know, your rhythmic dictation and things like that, you know. So that sort of forces the thing too. And then I wrote for the Teacher on Tap series, and probably for that series, I tried deliberately to cross as many styles as I could. So I probably wrote 200 or so little pieces of music in that time. And, you know, that sort of developed my confidence to be able to, you know, to write. I think, oh yeah, maybe I could write. So yeah, don't you love Zoom?
Oh yeah, it's the new norm, the joys of online meetings and whatnot. So you were talking about your experiences, particularly the catalogue of over 200 works that you wrote for the Teacher on Tap series, and you know, how that sort of gave you a bit of a pep up in terms of your confidence in writing.
Yeah, I think works would be a little bit. Some of them are, you know, 2 minutes long. But there are challenges when all you've got to work with is, say, minims, crotchets, and semi-breves, and 3 pitches. Then, you know, you have to get inventive, find some way of making something appealing to a student out of that. Yeah. So it was, you know, writing the pieces for the 13 books or whatever it is, well, you know, really got me thinking about musical styles and how I could write. And that was a big boost to, you know, to my competence and confidence as a writer. And that led me on to, you know, to write for bigger forms and bigger ensembles.
What are some of your favorite pieces that you've composed or arranged, and why did you, well, I guess I should ask, why do you favor them over some other pieces, shall we say?
Hard to know. I mean, usually the one you're working on at the time is your favorite, you know, until it's done, sort of lose interest. There's 1 or 2 that are my personal favorites. There's one little thing I wrote for a student decades ago, and then have rewritten since, you know, in the light of new knowledge, I suppose. But it's a little thing called Sicilienne for string orchestra and alto saxophone, and I've done versions of it for flute and clarinet and cor anglais. It's one of the prettiest things I've written, and I like it. There's some nice big band charts I've written. I wrote one for Ralph's band, which was lovely to hear played by those great musicians. There's a couple I've written for James Greening, who's one of my favourite musicians in the world, and those ones I'm quite proud of. There's a little piece I wrote for Paquito Rivera called Danza, just for clarinet and piano. Originally it was for flute and harp. That sort of worked really nicely. I'm happy with that little one. Some of the quartets, you know, I'm fond of. Probably the most popular ones are some of the arrangements. So the one that's that gets the most sort of mileage is a little arrangement I did of Blue Skies for clarinet quartet. And that's coming up for its 2000th flight now on YouTube.
Wow.
And it's sold innumerable copies to the most bizarre places in the world, you know. So that's probably been the most popular thing I've written, strangely enough. And I keep trying to work out what it is that people like so I can replicate it again. But yeah, those are the ones that stick out. But there's a lot of them now. It's hard to pick.
Of course. And yeah, Blue Skies, I've definitely had the pleasure of tutoring that particular piece at one stage in a former life, tutoring group clarinet. And yeah, the kids loved it. I don't know what it is, but yeah, if you find the secret to it and write another one, go for it.
Yeah. Oh, I've tried, believe me. Yeah.
Now, in terms of your composing, do you have a process when you're writing a piece? Like, is there a strategy that you have in mind, like when you're starting to write a piece, or is it sort of something that sort of comes and you jot down an idea and then work on that idea? Maybe talk us through your compositional process a bit.
Yeah, most of my work is done around 3 or 4 in the morning. So when it's really, really quiet and you're awake, I hear the piece internally. So usually I have a germ of an idea, maybe a harmonics, you know, sequence, or maybe I have a fragment of melody or something, and in a certain style. And then in those quiet hours, I will try and hear the thing in its entirety. So I'll try and get the form. I won't hear that much that's specific, but I'll hear shapes and a basic overall form. So I know how it's going to begin, roughly how it's going to end, and where it's going to go to in the middle. And then I can work anywhere in that continuum. You know, I can do the beginning and then maybe the end, and work back a section in the middle, and then work another section that leads into that, not necessarily, you know, composing from beginning to end. And then the last process is sort of a smoothing process to get each part to run into the next, giving an impression of inevitability, you know. So it's a patchy process, but that's the way it works. And a lot of it's just in the quiet of the night. I hear it and I come out, rush out to the keyboard in the morning and try and find out what it is that I've heard during the night, you know. I work on the computer. I find that a great asset in many ways. I use Logic Pro. So I think, you know, for any young person who wants to get into writing, you've got to master something like that. One of those forms of software that allows you access to a virtual studio so that you can just try things, you know. I mean, it'd be lovely to be able to pull a rehearsal of 15 people together and try things, but this way you can, you know, and it allows you to write outside of your comfort zone. It allows you to take risks without making a complete dick of yourself, you know. So I work on the computer and I use Finale for music copying, because my handwriting and my calligraphy are awful. So that's a great boon to me. What else would I say about that? I don't know. I always try and write what's appropriate to the style. And so once you have established what style the piece you're going to write, and there will be certain givens within that style will lead you to certain things. So there'll be certain formal conventions and things like that which will help the process. That's about it. That's about, you know, as close as it gets to any kind of real systematized approach to writing. You know, it's a little bit on the random side.
But that's okay. Everyone's different in the way they approach it. So just curious to sort of see how you went about it.
Yeah, that's it.
And would you say your arranging work, is that a similar kind of approach, like just a bit randomized, like you'd hear something in the middle of the night and think, oh, that could work well if I tweak this and tweak that sort of thing?
The great thing with arranging is that you're given the core material. You know, because it's an established piece out there in the public domain. With that, the first thing I would try to do would be probably to reharmonize it. So to give it a certain freshness, I would try and often put it in a style that's different to the style that it was written in. So that little twist gives it, you know, a quirkiness. I always try and put a little humor in. I just think I couldn't live my life without humor. So I don't see why I should, you know, live my music without humor. So, you know, there's always a little bit of humor in there, something, you know, to make it enjoyable.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. I try not to transgress, you know, what was the composer's original intention. So I don't.
I think we've lost Richard again. So whilst we're waiting for that connection to reconnect, again, we're talking to Richard Percival here on our very first Q&A session for 2021. As you can tell by the internet connection, it's pretty much summing up how 2020 went. But of course, with the connection and all that, we are very much trying our best to get that happening. But of course, the information that Richard is sharing with us is quite fascinating, and I'm very much enjoying talking to Richard about his insights and his experiences. And I'm hoping now we've got Richard back with us. Just got to unmute him. That's all. There we go.
Yeah, we're back.
We're back.
It's a bit like tap dancing in a minefield. You never quite know what's going to happen, but hopefully you can edit this together.
Well, I'll do my best. I was saying everyone's a bit like 2020, really. It's just sort of gone a bit pear-shaped in some areas. But as I said, the content is amazing, and talking to you is absolutely a treat, because hearing your stories and everything like that, it's a real pleasure for me and hopefully for everyone listening. But back on topic, I'd like to talk about what I was asking was sort of, was actually advice for younger players looking to branch out into arranging and composing. Is there anything you could share in terms of your experiences or things that you've learned that you wish you sort of had done earlier on, so you didn't sort of necessarily go around the long way in some areas?
Yeah, I think once again, it comes back to my personal one, is listen. You know, just listen and listen and listen and listen and listen to the greats. Transcribe. And that doesn't necessarily mean just getting scores. Sometimes the best thing is to sit down and literally try and transcribe. You know, that focuses your attention better than looking at somebody's score. I think talk to players, especially if there's instruments you don't play, you know, especially rhythm section players. Talk to them about what's possible on their instrument, what's comfortable, what they like to play. You know, talk to trumpet players about, you know, what can you lift through, or talk to trombone players about, you know, where can you use a chromatic scale at the bottom end of the instrument. Just get to know where pitfalls lie. I think develop your computer skills is the other thing. Is, you know, to use something with a virtual studio is such an advantage, because you learn so much, you know, without having to waste time. And then the other thing I'd say is just do it. Just write and write and write and write. That's really the way to do it. You know, don't sit around waiting to learn. Just write for whatever combination you can find, and do it. And, you know, eventually you'll find your voice, I think.
Yeah, trial and error, as they say.
They do.
Cool. Yeah, we're talking. We're going to move on to your teaching philosophy now. But just so everyone tuned in, who may have missed at the start, if you do happen to have a question for Richard, you are more than welcome to ask it. All I would ask is that you would type it in the chat section that we have in the Zoom thing. So if you do have a question, please type it in there and I'll read it out to Richard as we go along. But moving on, we're going to be talking about Richard and his teaching and educational experiences. Now, it goes without saying you are a wonderful educator and teacher, and that's evident through the amount of materials you've written, which we're talking about. You teach on tap shortly, but the output of students that you've had some fantastic students. We talked about Abbe, of course, who is you know, doing great things out there in the music scene today. But you know, you have taught at a lot of prestigious educational institutions such as St. Ignatius College. You were the head of saxophone there. You lectured and created the syllabuses for the contemporary theory and arranging courses at the Australian Institute of Music, AIM. And you taught at the Conservatorium High School, and of course, numerous guest lecturers and tutoring and all sorts of things. With all that experience teaching, I'm sure this has changed over time, but as it's sort of sitting now, how would you describe your teaching philosophy in terms of how would you approach teaching a student? I know this is a tricky question because every student's different, has different needs, but as a general sort of approach.
Yeah, that's a big question. I think one of the things that I've come to realize over time is that you can't teach someone to play a musical instrument. It's not a passive process, it's an active process. And really, you can best serve the student by being the equivalent of a coach. The initiative has to, and the energy has to come from the student, and you have to help them to channel it in the right directions, to not waste time, give them good advice and to lead them places. And sometimes it's just not possible to teach someone if they're not going to meet you halfway, by making a commitment of energy to it. Having said that, I will go out of my way to try and entice someone to listen. And this is my big bugbear, I think the art of listening is being lost. And the most valuable thing that we can do as teachers is to try and repair that damage. This goes back a long way. When I was 2.5, I had polio, and the way they treated it in those days was I went to my legs, so they put plaster casts on the legs, and other than falling over all the time, there wasn't much you could do. So I was static, and my mother came back from the war with what was called a portable radio in those days. 3 people could lift it, and it could pick up the local radio station. So around about, from 3 onwards, I was alone with the radio. And in those days, radio stations were different. They just didn't play the same 20 songs in rotation. It played a really wide range of things. It played all the music of the day, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, and Peter, Paul and Mary, and folk music, and all of those things that were popular music of the day, but also had a classical music program, a jazz program. I remember one of the first things that really appealed to me was they had a thing called Readings from the Bible. And the theme that introduced it was that Bach Arioso, played on oboe d'amore. I wouldn't know what it was. But at 3, I just listened to the whole range of music without any preconceptions, without any judgments. It just washed over me. And because I was alone, I had a real relationship with the music. It could take me to places. I actually listened to it and got inside it. And if it affected me, if it made me want to move, if it affected me emotionally or whatever it was, then I liked it, And for me, music works on, say, 4 basic levels. There's the mesmeric, which is just the beat, so like just a backbeat, just something that makes you physically want to move to the music. I need that, in music a lot of the time. There's the emotional level, which can be a beautiful melody, well crafted, or a melody supported with beautiful harmony. Then I think the 3rd level of appreciation is an intellectual appreciation where you understand what the composer or the performer is doing. So that gives you an extra level of appreciation because, alongside the actual beauty of the music, you've got the stunning, mastery of the play, so you've got that extra appreciation. And probably the 4th one is the most amorphous, you call like the spiritual collection of music, where it can take you to places that you wouldn't otherwise go. And for music, for me, a piece of music I like has to have a mixture of those. I have to have a relationship with the music that stimulates those things. So, same as you would with a partner, you could be with someone who had the best brain in the world, but if they weren't physically appealing to you, your relationship would be in trouble, or they could be immensely beautiful physically, but be completely dull, have no sense of humor. So a good piece of music for me needs to have those 4 component parts. And I just feel that a lot of people now are being shortchanged because music has become ubiquitous It's everywhere. It's on the telephone, it's behind ads, it's behind every documentary, it's in every shopping center, it's in the lift. Kids have headphones in now and listen, but they're not listening. It's just a noise to fill the void, but there's no real active listening. People listen while they drive the car. People go to restaurants, and music's constantly in the background. So it devalues music and it desensitizes people to music. I remember going down to quite a nice nightclub in the city, and there was a wonderful band. It was Nicky Grayson singing and 4 of the best musicians that we have in Sydney. And in the middle of it,
sorry there, Richard. We'll have to take it back a little bit. You were talking about your trip to the city and checking out one of Nicky Grayson's gigs.
Yeah, and the crowd talked over the band the whole time. And this woman went up to the band and requested a Duke Ellington tune, and then went and sat down and talked through it. So the whole art of listening has been lost. There was a time when music was, live music was the option. If you were going to go and hear somebody and you waited all week to see them, you didn't go and talk through it. You went and you actually listened. So my fear is that the ability to actually listen and have the kind of relationship that I have with music is difficult and is on the wane. And that's the thing that I'm fighting the most as a music teacher. There won't be an audience for us as musicians unless we educate people to listen and music to become important to them, and in order to do that, I think you've got to try and reach out. And that sort of takes me back to what I was saying. I will try and reach a student. When I wrote the Teacher on Tap series, I deliberately wrote 4 pieces in each level. One piece in the classical style, and another style, a piece in the pop style, a piece in the jazz style, hoping that there would be at least one piece there that would capture the attention of the student and then would start a train of listening, which would then branch out. And often I've been surprised. Often the piece that I think would be least appealing to them can sometimes be the piece that they, latch on to, and then I will start finding them pieces. When I first started teaching, in those days, cassette tape record. I made for each student a recording of 30 or 40 pieces from Marcel Mule up to David Sanborn, every style I could think of, every great player I could think of. I'd give them to the student. I'd say, take this away, listen to it, tell me which of the people, which of the players and which of the styles you like the best, and then I will compile you another CD of just those things. 1 in 10 at the most would have even listened to it. Even the 1 in 10 wouldn't have listened beyond a few tracks. So listening that's the thing that terrifies me, is that the art of listening, like the art of reading, these things are starting to be lost, and that's a disaster and a tragedy on a broad scale, but it's a disaster and a tragedy for our industry too, because, the audience is diminishing. So, the big part of my teaching philosophy is to get people to listen. By hook or by crook, I'll go out, I'll go to any kind of lengths to try and find something that will catch the student's attention and get them to become an active part of the learning process. And that's the big part of my philosophy, and that's the thing that I've structured all of my educational material around, is trying to capture people's attention, get them to listen and get them to participate in music. Once they've done that, they will never be dupes to the commercial, the commercial selling people who are just trying to sell a limited amount of music like a commodity. I really want people to start to listen to music, take adventures in music, have it take them to new places in their mind, So that, is pretty passionate, I suppose, but that's really what it is. That's what I'm striving to do with my students, is to get them to listen, basically, to listen and participate, and I'll do whatever it takes. And as long as they're willing to meet me at some stage, 50-50, and bring some energy to the process, then I'm happy, no matter what kind of level they achieve.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there. There's certainly, even in my time teaching, I've noticed there's certainly not just teaching, but performing as well. There certainly has been a paradigm shift in the way that students would approach music without even having listened to music, and some of them. And I'm just kind of like, really? How? And it's true, like trying to engage a student and to get them interested in music and sharing a passion in music through listening. It's such a yeah, it's something that certainly is becoming, unfortunately, more and more of an issue, and it's something that we need to kind of look at course correcting.
Yeah, I do think it's an important issue, and yeah, so that's what we do. I hope.
Yep.
That's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of us out there are trying to do this exact same thing. But yes, you spot on. I think it's certainly an important thing. Now, finally, I'd like to talk about your Teacher on Tap. Now, it's probably one of the most important teaching resources in Australia for woodwind teachers and, of course, students. Would be interested to hear your take on what was the genesis behind this series. I know you've talked about, it sort of covers, each level covers a different style, and I'm presuming that's, as we were talking about before, trying to engage a student on a particular style that they might be interested in or whatnot. What was the idea behind creating this series, and what was the goal with achieving this in comparison to some of the other teaching resources that were out there prior to Teacher on Tap?
I think one of the big things that I learnt in a vacuum, I came from a small town in New Zealand where I didn't have access to experienced musicians or teachers. So I tried to create something that would be useful to someone who was isolated. So I've tried to make it incredibly thorough. So each level moves incrementally, adds just a little each time, and tries to cover everything. And that's why I wrote the workshop manual, so that if a student doesn't have access to a teacher, or even if they have access to a teacher who's not particularly good, they can ferret out the information. The YouTube now, it goes a long way to solving that, because there is so much good material on YouTube if you want to seek it out, So I've tried to make it thorough, but I think music has to do with the ear more than the eye. And I found things like, the old tune a day tutors were great, really, they really came a lot, but there wasn't an oral component to it. So my idea was to try and produce something where it would be thorough and where there would be an audio component, so the student more or less had to listen. And so by creating the example tracks and then the play along tracks, the student was actively involved in the process of playing. They had to play in time, they had to play in tune, and they had a conceptual idea of how to approach the pieces. And I think that was the most important and the most different thing about it, when it was created. I started off just writing little things for students, duets, little exercises, that were accompanied. And when I was getting new students, I was finding students coming with faded photocopies of the same things. And I thought, well, it may be an idea to publish this. Obviously, it's useful to other teachers.
Mm-hmm.
When I came back from America, I was working on it, and Peter Dorich was working on a very similar concept. So the two of us got together and we combined our resources, and Peter was tremendous at all the technology side of things, and the music printing side of things. He was just brilliant. So we were complementary. We fitted together to create the series, and I'm pretty proud of it. And since then, I've created, a wealth of ensemble music to go with it, so that, once the student moves from just being a student on their own, they've also got access to resources for playing with other musicians, which is the next step. And the thing is to be involved. Music has so many pluses, so many things to bring. We all know about all the stuff about how it changes the shape of the brain, it increases your ability to think laterally, it allows you to learn languages. Those are great things, and they're important, and music does do that, but that's not a raison d'etre in itself. Music does other things for you. You have to learn to present yourself. You have to be able to organize yourself. You have to be self-critical. You have to be able to interact socially. you know, there are so many things that it brings you that it's one of the most rewarding and rich things that you can ever put your time into as a young person. You know, it should be compulsory. It is in those places like Finland, which have the highest academic, you know, records in the world. You know, it should be a compulsory part of what a young person does from the age of 3 or 4 or 5. You know, it should be a part of our life. And Richard Gill was very much into that. You know, as you know, he really was pushing for that, and I am too.
All right, so where were we? Oh yeah, okay. If there was one thing you wanted your students to take away from lessons with you, what would it be?
I think it's what we were saying about, most important for me is that they take away a much deeper and broader appreciation of music, the ability to listen and to have a personal relationship with music, and hopefully to be involved in creating music. That's what I aim for. And in some cases, it's been spectacularly successful. You know? So, but even, you know, the thing probably I'm most proud of is that I keep hearing from students who are still playing in little ensembles of their own, or in big bands, or in orchestras, you know. So they're still actively involved in music and still loving it. I have one student now who is in his 60s, later 60s, and he's going to go for the con. He's auditioning for the con outreach jazz course.
Wow.
So, you know, those are the real, you know, I'm very proud of my high achieving students, and I've got some wonderful students, you know. But, I'm just, the work that I try and do is to create an audience for music again. And that's really where it begins and ends.
Nice. Now we're coming to the tail end of this Q&A, and I know it's been a little bit up and down with the connection, but thanks for bearing with it, and thank you all for tuning in. Hopefully my editing skills you won't notice too much, but I don't profess to be a professional editor, sorry. But talking about the hot topic that everyone's talking about at the moment, and particularly in the music world, is this pandemic thing, the COVID-19. As musicians, as you know, it's affected all of us or everyone, not just musicians, but of course, you know, the entire planet. And it's affected us in different ways. For musicians, on our perspective, it's had a tremendously huge negative impact on our performance output. And of course, it has in certain times made teaching quite difficult. But just be curious to ask you, Richard, how would you envisage a musical landscape here in Sydney or beyond in a post-COVID world? How do you see things changing?
I think it's definitely going to change. I mean, it's already changed. You know, there is not as much live music. You know, I mean, patterns change. They started to change for me when I was young, when discotheques came in. You know, and people, it was easier and cheaper for people. And now a lot of young people will go and hear a DJ. You know, they're not discerning enough to want to listen to music. So the patterns of musical consumption have changed. It's expensive and often dangerous for people to go out, or inconvenient. So the ways that people consume music has changed, and hopefully there will be a resurgence in live music, but it won't be anything like what it was. So there'll be smaller audiences, I think, and maybe less opportunity. So I think, you know, if I was coming into the music world now, I would try and make use of the new platforms. I would try and find new ways of doing things. I wouldn't stay with the old paradigms of doing things. I'd try and find a niche that you could occupy on the electronic media, which is how most people are going to consume most of their music. I think that's what I would say. You know, I think as teachers, our most important work is to create an audience for music, you know, and as we do that, as we get more people involved, even at a fundamental level of playing, it's going to change their music consuming habits. And that's going to be important for the survival of a lot of us, you know, not so much me, but a lot of people as, you know, as professional musicians. It's very difficult because the opportunities to gain real life experience of playing is radically reduced from even the time that I started playing. So it will be a different landscape. The same things won't exist. So the idea is to be innovative and to try and make use of the opportunities that technology makes available to us, and then find a niche in that. That would be my thought on it. That's the most positive thing I could come up with, what is a rather grim reality.
Yeah. But yeah, you're certainly right. We kind of have to adapt and think outside the box and try and work with what's out there and work it to our advantage, I guess, in terms of our survival as musicians anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Now, on a lighter note, this is a question that I ask all the guests, and curious to hear what you've got in store for us with this one. But if you had only 10 minutes to practice, and only 10 minutes, what would you practice and why?
So I'd be thinking this would be, as a way of preparing yourself for playing or for recording or something. So a way of getting yourself in touch with the instrument. One thing I would do would be to practice all major scales and 12 keys over the full range of the instrument. So I'd start B flat major up to top F down to B flat major, then the same again, add an A flat and go through the cycle of 12 keys. I find that's a really useful way if you're really disciplined with getting a good attack on the low note. You're getting a good clean technique into the high register. You really get yourself in touch with the instrument. So that's something I would do. I would either play long tones or a sustained melody softly with vibrato, I think. I've got one little thing I like to do. You probably know the Bozza Etude Caprices, or the last one in the book, that number 12, the last.
Oh, yes.
And, if I'm I always do that, because I figure, the instrument's working if you can play that, so that, that's what I use. I sent a student recently to another teacher. I always do that, with high achieving students. I always send them off to Michael, or I send them off to, whoever I can to get a second. And one teacher said, it's good, but they're not playing, from the diet, they're not playing from the core muscles, it's not centered low enough in the body. And that started me thinking maybe I'm not emphasizing this enough. So of late, what I've been doing is spending a lot of time, and this also, something came up on YouTube about just starting on the bottom B flat of the instrument, attacking the B flat cleanly, moving up a semitone, moving up a tone, moving up a minor third, a third, a fourth, a fifth to the octave, and doing that off bottom B flat, B, C, and C sharp. I find that's for the saxophone, that's a really useful way to get in touch with the instrument, to get the air coming from the right place, to get the airway open, to get, to get the embouchure in, to get the interior of the mouth in place. So that's something I've been doing. So in that 10 minutes, that would be it.
Wow.
Those are the things I would do in order to try and get myself in touch with the instrument and ready to play.
Wow, that's a lot to cram in 10 minutes, but it's all good stuff. Cool. Well, Richard, thank you so much for your time this evening. I know it was a little bit trying with the connection, but we did get there in the end. And as I said earlier, it's been an absolute delight to talk to you. And for you, I enjoyed listening enjoyed listening to you sharing your thoughts and insights on music and your experiences. And as I said, I'm just always very surprised with these interviews. There's so much more than I had previously known, and I always get a lot out of these, and yours is no exception. So again, thank you so much for you taking the time out to have a chat with us this evening. And is there any, in terms of keeping an eye on what's happening with Richard, Percival, is there anything or any websites or anything we should be aware of, or any links or anything like that maybe we can check out possibly?
Yeah. So thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed this very much, despite the rotten connection.
Yes.
And I think this initiative of yours is a wonderful initiative, and you be congratulated for that. It's a great thing to do, and I've enjoyed watching them very much. I'm no longer playing live. I've retired from that. but I am constantly putting things up on YouTube, and that's hundreds of things up there now. So the one thing, if you are interested in seeing, you know, new things coming up in terms of composition and things that I play, our little YouTube tag is Teacher on Tap Woodwind, and you know, new things will be going up there as I complete them and put them up. So that's the best link I can give you if people are interested in following these things.
Cool. Well, I'll put that link on the description below for the YouTube watchers, and they can click, and they've got access to the Teacher on Tap books as well as the recordings. And excuse me, it's not Corona. It's a comedy errors tonight, but what's this? Oh yeah, so yeah, I'll put the link up. You'll have link to the Teacher on Tap, the new arrangements, new pieces, and the YouTube link, of course. But yeah, again, before anything else goes wrong tonight, of course, thanks again so much to you, Richard. Thank you all for tuning in, and thanks for those who participated this evening. And I will be around next month for our next Q&A. So stand by for an announcement on that in the next couple of weeks. But until then, stay safe. Remember to wash those hands, and we'll catch you next time. Thank you.
Good night, Nate.